So our next presentation is by Anandi Hira, and Anandi's a graduate from USC Computer Science Department with a PhD, and she was working on Kokomo and function points and how to use function points in the Kokomo model. She initially started working for Technology, and now Anandi works for the Software Engineering Institute. And she has been instrumental in putting this forum together. Without Anandi, there would be no forum. So thank you, Anandi, for your work. And it's my pleasure to present Anandi here for her presentation.
Thanks, Brad. So this is a research literature review that I had completed at Technology Research before I left. And basically what I wanted to do is understand, what is the US DoD cost estimation community saying about Agile? One of my tasks there was to come up with ways to estimate for Agile projects. And I figured as a researcher, as a PhD student, the first step is to understand what does the community know so that I know what the baseline is and where I can go from there. So this is the outline of today's presentation. I'm just going to go over the motivation of the work, the steps I took, and then get into the answers and questions I've asked and conclude it. So as I said, the real motivation for this was to understand what it is that the DoD cost estimation community knows and understands about Agile, and what kinds of estimating models or methods they are currently using, so that I can understand if there are things I can implement or kind of build on, things that already exist, or if there's guidance on what has worked or what hasn't worked in the community. So that way I can come up with either a new method or a new way. And so that's what the goal for this whole presentation is. I'm going to go over everything that I've learned from the papers and presentations that I had skimmed through for this research review. As far as other studies that try to do something similar, there are several academic papers that did literature reviews that address different aspects of Agile, how people are applying Agile, what are the benefits that they've received, things like that. I was only able to find one literature review that targeted the public sector, which includes the government. It's not clear whether or not that's necessarily the US government, however. But generally speaking, the US government and DoD is not represented well in these academic papers. So for this research review or literature review, I had to resort to what would technically be called gray literature. So I will explain specifically what venues I gathered papers and presentations from in order to perform this review. So these are the high-level steps that I took to complete my literature review. So first, I identified where I was going to gather my papers and presentations, identify the major themes of the studies as I skimmed through the references. That's step 2. And then as I was skimming through the references, I noted important information or things that I thought would be of interest. So I put them into like a notes document, and then finally I look through and kind of review my notes and kind of group them by topic and categories so that I can identify some general heuristics or general claims that I could make on what the DoD understands about Agile and how to estimate for Agile projects. All right, so the questions that I will be asking and addressing in this research are, what are the benefits that the US DoD has experienced from adopting Agile? What are the challenges that the US DoD experiences in adopting Agile? Has the need for cost estimates reduced? and which size metrics or estimation models are currently being used in the US DoD. And these are the conferences or symposiums or forums that I referenced. These are ones that the US DoD cost estimation community usually attends to or go to. And so I went on their websites and tried to go as far back as I could in their archives to find anything that was related to Agile. And I also included the keywords iterative and incremental in my search because in the beginning, the US DoD had typically used Agile as almost synonymous to iterative and incremental. So I found 85 studies through that process that were relevant to the study, that in some way talked about Agile or estimation. Of those, I referenced 63 in this research because they specifically answered the research questions that I asked. This is the screenshot of how I was managing my references. So you'll see that I gathered every piece of information I possibly could on the papers and presentations that I found. And then I worked on finding ways to categorize or define the paper or presentation. And so these were the categories that I ultimately decided on. There was a primary topic, so whether they talked about like at a high level estimation metrics or just Agile in general. The functional area is whether or not it's specifically for software, because there's of course a lot of general or hardware type of cost estimation research as well in the DoD. And then the process, whether or not it's Agile. So even though I was focused on Agile for this literature review, I was also keeping track of all software and cost estimation related things that would come up as, like in conferences or in forums that I attended. And so that's why I had that column. And then metrics, so what kinds of size metrics specifically they were using, especially for cost estimating. And finally, what data set was used if it was an empirical study. And then finally, my brief notes. So after I looked at all of the papers and presentations, and I went to 2021 as my last year, by the way. And so the first paper I found was in 2012, all the way to 2021. If I were to look at where all the papers and presentations came from, this is the distribution. So as you can see, ICEA has been a major place where most of the papers and presentations come from. And after that is the Joint IT and Software Cost Forum. And the main categories of the papers and presentations are these 5: cost estimation, general experience, which means that people are talking about the experiences of adopting Agile or just giving like an educational presentation on what Agile is and how to adopt to it. Metrics, what kind of metrics they're using to track and manage their projects, earned value management, and data collection. And this is just a quick explanation of what step 3 of the research process looked like. So what I did from the notes in the Excel sheet I showed earlier, I then categorized them by major categories. And then I further categorized them by more and more similar topics until I could get something that could be represented in some kind of graphic or list that was on a very specific topic. All right, so now we'll get into the actual answers to the 4 research questions that I had addressed or came up with. And so the first one is, what are the benefits that the US DoD has experienced from adopting Agile? One of the major concerns in the DoD and government is the way we have to build software is very different from the commercial industry. We don't have the liberty to be as flexible with getting rid of requirements if we simply can't get to them, or if we have reached our budget limits or schedule limits, either one. We have to, in some cases, we have to build out certain capabilities because they are required by the government. So a lot of the questions that or concerns that the US DoD have is, can we benefit from adopting Agile practices in the DoD as the commercial world does? And so the answer to this question, or to answer this question, I look at what are the benefits that all the papers and presentations have listed. Now, again, not all of them are necessarily empirical in that they provide data to back up their claims. But what I first did as the step was develop a causal graph of all of the descriptions and explanations of what Agile is, what Agile isn't, and what are the benefits that people have been experiencing by adopting Agile practices. So what I found were that the principles or the practices that people talked about had generally fallen into these 4 categories: incremental development, high collaboration, process improvement, and quality. Now, if you look in the academic papers, they usually focus on the first 3, but in the DoD, there is a huge emphasis on quality because, of course, while we want to adopt Agile development, we have to make sure that our programs work as expected, that they are able to scale to the needs that the warfighters will have, for example. So quality was a big emphasis that people wanted to stress, that while we go Agile, that doesn't mean we're letting go of quality. I was then able to categorize the effects into short-term definite effects that people had noticed, and then long-term effects that people are looking for in the data. They might not necessarily experience immediately, but eventually over time with practice, they might notice these kinds of long-term effects. So increased productivity, lower costs, faster deployment into the field. These were things that people did not necessarily notice all of the time or upfront. It wasn't until the teams had become more experienced, as well as a little bit of change from the government side, where they were actually able to notice those kinds of changes or benefits. Now, some papers did do an empirical analysis. And so I then compared studies that did empirical analyses and that looked at specifically whether they noticed improvements or no improvements between Agile and non-Agile projects. And so I categorized them by productivity, schedule, growth, and quality. So what's interesting is, generally speaking, the dark blue bars means Agile performed better. So we're seeing that the dark blue bars are generally higher than the light blue or the light gray bars, which means that we are generally seeing an improvement or a benefit in adopting Agile. However, in some cases, the difference is not significant. Actually, in most of these cases, the difference is not significant. So we do have a significant number of studies that are saying, we're not really seeing a difference in the data, whether we're getting, better productivity or not between Agile and non-Agile projects. And I think that this is just due to the nature of DoD, as well as how new we are and how much adjustment is needed both on the development and the government side in order to really reap the benefits of Agile development. Right, so I compared the benefits to the benefits found in academic literature reviews. And instead of listing out all of the ones where they were similar or the same, I wanted to focus on where the changes were. And so here I have listed the benefits on the left side that were not in the academic studies, but we identified through the DoD studies. And on the right, vice versa. So benefits that are not in this study, but were listed in the academic literature reviews. And so if you were to actually read through these and summarize them, most of these differences come from the change or the difference in environments. So because government, we have a huge emphasis on risk management and identifying our risks. But in the commercial world, we don't really hear about that, or at least in the academic world. In the papers they do, we don't really hear too much about that. So that was something that we had in the DoD literature review, but was not listed in the academic study. But on the other hand, in the academic ones, one of the main things was improvement in learning new technologies, which wasn't listed or mentioned in the DoD. Now, of course, I'm not saying the DoD doesn't learn new technologies and apply them, but that's not usually the focus. The focus is fulfilling our requirements, building a system that does what it needs to do.
Anandi, I have a quick question. In the left column, the bottom bullet reduces masking cost growth as working code. Could you explain what that is?
Yes, so some, actually very few, I think there was only 1 or 2 papers maybe that talked about this. So they felt that with the iterative evaluation of the code, they were able to not mask or not identify cost growth as working code. So they were able to reduce the amount of code that was being built unnecessarily.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, so what are the challenges that the DoD faces in adopting Agile methodologies? There were quite a few studies that talk about this, and then what I did was I categorized it by the type of role or function within the DoD lifecycle or the DoD projects, if you will, and the kinds of challenges they specifically face. Now, some challenges are the same across these. I don't think I actually listed any of them in this presentation, but let me note, and I actually forgot to note this earlier also, the causal graph, a lot of these tables or graphs that I present here are not the full version. So I have worked on a paper and we're working on publishing the paper, but the paper would have more complete graphs and tables. So this is not a complete list of the challenges, but I just listed several ones that I thought were the most important or the most relevant and the most oftenly repeated in the literature that I was reviewing. And so again, a lot of these challenges, I'm not going to read through them, but if you look at the slides and you want to summarize them, a lot of the challenges are caused because of the difference between the Agile methodology and your typical DoD process and the way the acquisition lifecycle really works. So Agile is all about flexibility, embracing the fact that you don't know what the end product is going to look like, whereas the government and DoD processes very much are based on the fact that they should know or do know what the end product is supposed to look like. And so we have this clash in philosophies, basically. And that's what the major challenges identified are, is this balancing between uncertainty and what we don't know versus having to work with very rigorous and strict policies and rules. And, how do I balance between the two? And so this manifests across all of your functions, whether it's management or the developers or even the cost estimators. We're all struggling with how do we balance between the two.
So Anandi, can I ask a quick question?
Yes, go ahead.
12 years ago or 10 years ago, you started in 2012. in government, we didn't even know what Agile was then. And a lot of the studies you did back then probably surfaced a lot of the things you're saying here. Several skeptics emerged. We don't get it. We don't understand. I would submit that in the last 2 or 3 years, with the growth of software factories, with the serious emphasis at the OSD level on moving away from measures of, you know, productivity and moving towards measures of, did we deliver working software? I would contend that the government got better. And did that emerge out of your data over time? Are there some clear boundaries where things started to show improvement or attitudes changed within the last, let's say, 3 to 4 years as opposed to 10 years ago?
That is a great question. I honestly didn't have the time, but I did want to see how these challenges and even benefits had changed over time. And maybe if I'm allowed to or I'm able to, that could be a great follow-up to this study. But as far as unofficially, so like not really based on anything empirical or a rigorous analysis of the literature, I will say that what you are saying is true. However, we are still seeing challenges. So we have seen some successful implementation of Agile in the government. It's not, unicorn, it's not non-existent. However, we do still face a lot of challenges with, we don't really have the requirements. How do we estimate this? Or we don't really know what the requirements are. So, what are we supposed to do at this point? Or how do we move forward or plan for this? How do we, some other concerns is how do we, report or submit these reports that are required by the government and also be agile in an agile way. Now we're moving away from some traditional metrics like SLOC. So how can I, get away from reporting SLOC, but use something else that we are using, such as story points? And so there are still some challenges. I wouldn't say that they're all ironed out, but we have definitely made improvements in the past few years, as you've mentioned. All right, so comparison to the academic literature reviews, there has been a difference in the kinds of challenges that the academic literature reviews found compared to the ones that I found through the DoD ones. And that's, again, just a difference in cultures. The academic studies usually look at the industry, whereas, the DoD is completely different. So I found that the major theme in this literature review I did was really focusing on the cost estimation. Now, of course, I did also target the cost estimation community. So, but the academic studies really looked at the management and the developers, the team and the people aspects of challenges. So how well is management able to work with the developers, or how well are developers adjusting to the changes? And so it was a completely different view. While we were more process oriented, the academic and industry is more people oriented. Okay, so the third question I ask is the need for cost estimates reduced? And one of the reasons I asked this question is because I got asked this question after a couple of my presentations at conferences. With the industry moving agile, they have found that they don't really need to do estimates so much anymore, because the concept of agile is we'll work on the highest priority items as long as we have either schedule or budget. Once we reach our schedule or budget limits, at that point, we have done the best we can with the resources we've used, and we have provided you the highest priority items and a working software. So either way, they are successful whenever they stop. Now, that's the concept. However, in industry, a lot of times what we actually see is they're never really done, right? I mean, businesses are continuing to maintain and update their software over iterations, and they're working with their clients and getting the bugs and working on them. And so they might not ever really reach this theoretical stopping point. But even if they do, because they're working with a specific limit, by the end of it, they have done the best they can, but you do have working software with at least the highest priority features or functions. So in that case, estimating doesn't really make sense to them. Why would I need to estimate the cost of my total project? I don't know what my total project is going to look like right now. It will completely depend on the budget and schedule needs of the customer. So the industry, the commercial world sees a decline. And what I did here is I did a Google search trends on Agile estimation, software effort estimation, and Agile software development. And so you can see that as Agile became more popular, as it grew, the estimation topics had actually reduced. Except for here in 2018, we start to notice this term Agile estimation become more important. So I would say that while at first when Agile was new, and Agile started in 2000. So you can see this goes only as far back as 2004, but Agile is still very new in the beginning here. And so we see this rapid decline in software cost estimation being a term that people look up for, and not Agile estimation kind of shows up here and there. But generally they're saying, do we really need to do estimates? Probably by 2018, some environments or more environments started to realize, actually, we do need to do estimates on some degree. And I had actually read some articles that talk about, Agile estimation. They're not academic papers, but just articles on the web. And there are arguments where people are saying, no, we don't need it. And yes, we do. And there are industries and organizations that are across this whole scope. And so it really just depends on how that particular organization runs. Okay, now in my major categories, which I identified earlier, what I did was I grouped all of the remaining categories and just called them general experience. And then I look at the trend of the estimation and all of the other categories and how they trend over time. And that's what this graph here is. And you can see in the DoD, however, there is a pretty consistent growth in both topics. Like they grow together. We're talking about Agile, and we're also talking about how do we estimate for Agile in almost equally over time. All right, so last question, and the most important question for cost estimators. So what cost estimation models or methods exist for Agile DoD projects right now? So I looked through all of the papers that even talk about cost estimation. These are not all empirical studies. A lot of times it's cost estimators that are talking about concepts or ideas of how we think we should move forward. Some cases it's Agile teams saying this is what we're using. And very few cases of people saying this is what we're using and this is what our model looks like. So what I found is that generally speaking, the DoD is considering or looking at all kinds of metrics and how they might want to use any one of them in order to build cost estimate models for Agile projects. What I did here was I categorized these size metrics by level of granularity. And for those of you who might be familiar with Dr. Ali Malik's work and his PhD with Dr. Bain, what he did was he looked at the life cycle and categorized what kind of size metrics can be identified or calculated at different life cycles based on the information that you have available at the time. And I kind of expanded that graph in my PhD dissertation and looked at all of the different kinds of size metrics that exist in the academic literature and how they map to the life cycle phases. And so I used that as a basis for how to identify the metrics that the DoD identified. So that's how they are horizontally grouped. And then they're grouped by color, by type. And so this regular blue are Agile metrics, the dark blue are function points, and the light blue are just the other metrics that exist that have been mentioned. And so this bar graph over here looks at the data points by the major categories. So we have requirements, FTE or team counts, that's just number of people, FTE, and then Agile metrics and function points. So this shows us that the two types of metrics that we're most looking at are Agile metrics and function points. Agile metrics make sense because they are going to be used by the development team. So these are metrics that would be readily available by the contractors, by the developers, and we could use the existing data on the existing projects and their story points that they might have on them and try to build a cost estimating model. The problem with that, however, is that Agile metrics are subjective. They don't hold across teams, much less organizations. And so we're not sure how well we would be able to build cost estimating models using Agile metrics. So a solution to that problem is, why not use function points? Because function points are objective. There are specific rules on how to calculate them. So they should be objective across teams and organizations. But the problem with function points is that it requires a huge learning curve. We would have to there are so many different variants of function points, as you can see here. And so if different organizations are using different variants, we wouldn't have sufficient data points to build a generalizable cost model across all the organizations. There are also a couple of studies that talked about how to use multiple size metrics throughout the life cycle. So you might want to use one metric at one point of time and then switch over to a different metric as you get more information on your project. And so the two ways that have been suggested are, the first one is using function points up front. That way you can build a model that's generalizable and people can figure out what the estimate is based on the functionality of the software. And then as the developers are actually developing, they would give us the story points, and then we can start to use story point based models. And then the other suggestion is use function points up front again, but instead of using story points, this one organization found that when they count the number of messages that are sent from any two components, either within internal to the software or external to the software, they found a good correlation to SLOC from messages. So they had their own messages to SLOC converter, and then they would be able to use their SLOC-based cost estimating models. Okay, so I did mention earlier that there were not a lot of papers that actually provided estimation models that would be relevant to the Agile world. There were only a few, and these are the ones that I was able to find here. So Wilson Rosa, who presented earlier today, for those of you who are here, he has been working for a few years now in developing cost estimating relationships and models for Agile programs using non-SLOC, non-source lines of code based metrics. And so since I stopped in 2021, the latest work he did was based on requirements. The presentation he did earlier today came out after I stopped looking at papers and presentations. And he looked at other size metrics. For those of you that were not here, he looked at function points, story points, and different kinds of size metrics. Here, there's one study that looked at how you could get an estimated slog based on the complexity level of your story. And so this was probably based on data from a single organization, but it is a rule that, or kind of a rule that people could try to use for ballpark estimates, especially upfront. And here's another rule of thumb that I was able to find. So one study found that it takes approximately 36 function points per staff month to be developed. And then the schedule, you raise the function points to 0.33 to get your schedule months. So this shows us that we don't have a lot of cost estimating models that are openly available that the DoD can use. All right, so comparison to academic literature reviews. I found that in the academic studies, the most popular methods or types of analysis methods that they were looking at were regressions or models using some kind of size metric. That could be slog, function points, use case points, whatever size metric they're looking at. Expert judgment, planning poker, which is a method that Agile development teams usually use to figure out what stories or what requirements they're going to work on in the upcoming sprints, and neural networks. The most popular size metrics that were looked at are story points, function points, and use case points. And if I were to compare these results to what we found in the DoD literature, for the most part, we're both looking at function points, the DoD and the academic world. And so I thought that was interesting. Also, both are looking at story points. So those were two ways that we agreed. Use case points was popular when they were first developed in the academic world, but there has been a decline over time. And the DoD was just too late to kind of jump on that bandwagon. So we kind of skipped the whole use case points and looking at that. Although I did find one or two people that were trying to use use case points. While the academic studies also tried to focus on more subjective methods, more agile methods, so expert judgment and planning poker, the government and DoD focused on more parametric and objective methods. And of course, in the DoD, we have estimates that are done at different levels, and then we have to be able to defend our estimates and explain how we came to those estimates, as well as reconcile with the different levels of estimates that are done. And so with the DoD, subjective methods just won't take you very far. All right, so summarizing what I found through this literature review that I did, I found that in the government/DoD, there was a mix of whether we were experiencing the kind of improvements or benefits that the commercial world does. So there were improvements, but it wasn't overwhelming. Everyone's seeing improvements and everyone's having these specific benefits. It really depends on how experienced and how the interaction with the government is. Generally speaking, in the DoD, we are facing challenges specifically with metrics and how to balance the uncertainty that's being embraced with agile methodologies and having structure and predictability with the government processes. Different from industry, in the government, estimates are very much required. It's still a topic of interest and need in the DoD, but more than that, the government is not necessarily changing their requirements on needing estimates. So we don't see that need going away anytime soon. And as far as cost estimates in the DoD, generally speaking, there's a lack of agreement, if you will, in what size metric should be used or what estimation method should be used. So we're still very new at this, still very much in the exploratory phase of figuring out what method, what way should we go forward in. All right. So in summary or in closing, I just want to say the DoD can experience benefits of Agile. We are seeing that we are. I think it would be really interesting to kind of look at if there's specific characteristics that might be able to predict when programs are experiencing those benefits or when they're not, when they're experiencing the improvements or when they're not. I think that would help the DoD and government to be able to focus on or try to change the culture if needed, or make changes such that they are more consistently seeing improvements and benefits. And again, Agile estimation, still a topic of discussion and of importance to the DoD. And, you know, I think that it will require some work for us to be able to come up with something that the DoD at large can use. All right, and that's all I have. So let me hand it over for some questions. I know we're a little bit over, so if we can keep it short, great, but I'm happy to answer questions. Okay, no questions. Then I'll hand it over to Brad to close out today. Thank you for staying on and listening to my presentation.
I don't think Brad's here.
Are you on mute? Brad not here? If Brad's not here, I can close our event today. I want to thank all the speakers. I want to thank all the attendees. Really glad to see everybody and for your dedication. All the presentations today were so interesting, and I know we're going to be collecting them, making them available to the members. Tomorrow we start again, so hope to see everybody tomorrow. We do have another keynote. Dr. Paul Nielsen will be giving the keynote tomorrow, and so that will start our second day in terms of the first bookend, and then we have a whole nother day of wonderful presentations. And so I encourage everybody to come back, and thank you all for today, and thanks again to Anandi, who put together this whole 2-day session that we're doing, which is our first International BAME Forum. So thanks to everyone. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. Good night, y'all.
Thank you, everybody.
See you all.